This is Newsmax TV. I'm Ashley Martella. We're joined by Brad Smith, the chairman and co-founder of the Center for Competitive Politics, a nonprofit educational organization in Alexandria, Virginia, just outside of Washington. Mr. Smith is a former chairman of the Federal Election Commission. Now, he's a professor of law at Capital University Law School. He's one of the country's foremost experts on campaign finance law. Welcome to Newsmax TV, Brad.
Thanks, Ashley.
President Obama and liberal Democrats are pushing the House to vote on a controversial campaign finance bill that effectively circumvents the Supreme Court ruling on corporate campaign contribution restrictions as they relate to free speech. What are the dangers of this legislation as you see them?
Well, this legislation is one of the most partisan pieces to come down the pike. One of the problems with campaign finance regulation is it's always used for partisan advantage and to insulate incumbents. But usually there's at least a veneer of sort of bipartisanship. Corporations and unions are treated even-handedly. In this one, there's no such attempt to do that. The court freed up both unions and corporations to participate in the elections, but this legislation attempts to put the clamps back down only on corporations. And it's clearly because Democrats believe that corporations are going to favor Republicans in the elections, and they're scared. They want to stop it. So it puts burdensome new regulations on corporations, duplicative regulations, some of which are absolutely absurd, like it would require as many as 6 disclaimers as to who's paying for the ad in a 30-second ad. And generally, it's just, the question is whether there are any Republican senators that are gullible enough to not filibuster this and let the Democrats institute a permanent advantage in elections.
In case someone out there does not know, please explain the Supreme Court ruling in Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission.
Sure. Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission is really a simple case in the end. The question is whether or not corporations and unions can spend money to speak about politics and about politicians. The government took the position that they could not. And this is really a pretty extreme position when you think about it. A lot of Americans are uneasy with the idea, but think about this. The government's position was that corporations could not spend a penny in an election. And that meant, and the government argued, that a corporation could not publish a book or distribute a book or a movie. Well, I mean, how are almost all books and movies distributed and published? They're published by corporations. In the case at hand, a nonprofit conservative group called Citizens United was incorporated, like most nonprofits are. The government said, because you're a corporation, you can't spend any money in a campaign. They wanted to distribute a documentary movie called Hillary the Movie. So the government's position was really quite far-reaching, and the Supreme Court rejected it. They said you cannot have a blanket censorship rule on corporations from speaking. And that is the nuts and bolts of Citizens United. It's met with a lot of hysteria in the press, but I think when people really look at the basic ruling and remember the government's position was it could censor books and movies, I think most people find it to be a very agreeable decision.
We know you've been looking closely at the position of Obama Supreme Court nominee Elena Kagan on the matter of campaign finance reform and how it relates to political speech freedom. What's your take on it?
Well, Solicitor General Kagan has a very thin record, as people know. She hasn't published a lot. She's not served as a judge. She's played her cards politically throughout her career pretty close to the vest. So people are wondering, where does she stand? And the Citizens United case gives us maybe some window into that. She was the Solicitor General when the case was first argued, and the government made its rather astonishing argument that it had the right to censor books and movies. The Supreme Court asked to have the case re-argued, and this time Solicitor General Kagan actually argued the case herself. And she backed away somewhat from the government's position insofar as she said the government had never really tried to censor books, and she further said that if it did, a publisher might have a pretty good as-applied legal challenge, that is, to challenge the application of the law just as it applies to that particular publisher. So she tried to kind of soften the government's position there. But I think it's still one that people should know, and Senator McConnell, the minority leader, has been asking, what does she personally believe, and to what extent was she merely arguing the best case the government could put forward? Because I think we have a reason to know if our Supreme Court justices think that the government has the power under the First Amendment to ban books and movies.
Brad, Kagan has never been a judge, never sat on a court, yet she's nominated to the highest court in the land. In your opinion, is she qualified?
Well, I don't think that you have to have been a judge to go to the Supreme Court, and there have been at least a few examples where that has not been true. But you definitely have to show some strong legal acumen. She's got an impressive pedigree, but she's not been a Solicitor General for long. She's not written a lot scholarly, and I think the biggest thing people need to know is, what is her real judicial philosophy? What are we going to get when she is on the court? How does she think about these key constitutional issues? There's been very little of that put forward, and so a good hearing is necessary. And I think the efforts to rush this hearing through before Republican senators have had a chance to review the documents from the Clinton library is probably a mistake. And I think people should expect a long, serious hearing. Now, having said that, I know Solicitor General Kagan a bit. I've met her a couple of times. I don't know her well. She strikes me as a very calm, reasonable, thoughtful person. But lots of people meet that criteria. There's probably a bit more that's required. So I think a good, thorough vetting of her real judicial philosophy, trying to get a handle on what kind of judge she would be, is very important, much more important than if she had been a judge and we had a lot of decisions that we could look at.
On another matter, Pennsylvania Democratic Senate candidate Joe Sestak says the White House offered him a job in exchange for his not running against Arlen Specter. If that's true, how serious is that?
Well, this is one of those things that's very, very tough to do much about in practice. You know, here's the reality. Let's suppose they said, well, Mr. Sestak, we'd like to offer you a job as Undersecretary of the Navy, but of course to take that position you'd have to drop out of the Senate race. That would merely be stating a factual statement. I mean, you can't be in that position as Undersecretary and be running for the Senate. So it's the kind of deal that just has a feel of a certain sleaziness to it if it's true. And there are statutes that prohibit offering federal employment or gain for particular political actions, and there are statutes that prohibit federal employees from trying to influence campaigns, which arguably people in the administration were doing. And yet the reality is that all of those are very, very tough to enforce in practice, and I don't think that we're going to see in the end much come from this. This is really something that in the end it's going to depend on whether the voters think it matters. You know, what standard of ethics do the voters want, because they've got the power at the ballot box.
Attorney General Eric Holder telling an audience in Paris on Memorial Day that he and Obama are committed to battling corruption. This from the same man behind the pardon of Mark Rich during Clinton's last days. Your reaction, please.
Well, you know, every president says they're going to battle corruption. This administration has done quite a bit of grandstanding about lobbyists and so on. But in the end, you know, what we've seen ever since Democrats retook Congress in 2006 and since this administration came on after the 2008 elections is typical Washington insider dealing. It seems like, you know, favors go to favored businesses. The TARP funds, it seems to matter on the bailout money, whether you have the right connections, what you can get. It's not just the administration, it's in Congress as well. So, you know, there's always a lot of talk about this, but this is one where you've got to say, we'll believe it when we see it. This administration, I think it's fair to say, has largely brought its Chicago politics into Washington. And I don't think that should be shocking to folks who really paid attention during the 2008 campaign.
Arizona passes an immigration law that experts say is weaker than existing federal law that's not being enforced. Now, Holder is considering a legal challenge of the law while admitting to Texas Congressman Ted Poe that he hasn't even read it. What does that say to you about Holder's credibility?
Well, what it says to me is that the administration is interested in using the Arizona law to score points with a certain part of their base. And it also says to me that a lot of this is just purely an emotional, symbolic reaction for some of the folks in this administration. If you look at the Arizona law, as you point out, it follows federal law. I've seen it referred to many times in the press as Arizona cracking down on illegals. Actually, there's not really even any evidence they're cracking down on illegals. It's not like they've hired more police or told police to make this a priority or sent, you know, added folks into border regions. They've just told police that when you stop people for some other offense, if you then also have some independent reason to believe that the person might be here illegally, you should inquire about that. That's really a pretty modest statute. So I think what we're seeing here is a sign of an emotional, symbolic issue to certain parts of the far left. And apparently the administration has made the gamble that it will excite more of these folks than it will turn off centrists, because, you know, all the evidence shows that independents, Republicans, and even Democrats tend to be supportive of this law. So obviously they think, though, that they can energize a small portion of the base, I think, and I do think it reflects their own deeply held beliefs. You know, we saw a year ago when President Obama immediately leaped to the side of a minority Harvard law professor against local police before he had all the facts in. And I think we're seeing that again here, this immediate leap to, you know, we can't trust these whites, inherently they're a bunch of racists, we have to side with this minority. And that's sometimes done without really looking carefully at all the facts. I think that reveals something about what's working, their deep outlook on the world.
And finally, Brad, your nonprofit website is campaignfreedom.org. Please explain what it is, what it does, and how people can get more information about it.
Right. Campaignfreedom.org is the website of the Center for Competitive Politics, and what the center does is it works to promote freedom in the realm of politics. It works against things like the fairness doctrine. It works against efforts to silence pastors who want to speak about issues and how they relate to their flock, so to speak. And we work heavily on campaign finance issues where we think there's been an effort to silence speakers in the public realm. People can go to the site campaignfreedom.org, www.campaignfreedom.org, and there's a lot of information there about the Disclose Act, about Solicitor General Kagan's views on campaign finance and the possibility of book banning, about various other efforts to limit political speech, and I hope people will take a look.
The chairman and co-founder of the Center for Competitive Politics, Brad Smith. Thanks so much for sharing your views with us here at Newsmax.
Thank you, Ashley.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.